Okay, hi everyone. It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Rex Ying. So Rex is an assistant professor in the Department of Computer Science at Yale University. His research focus includes algorithms for graph neural networks, geometric embeddings, and trustworthy machine learning on graphs. He is the author of many widely used GNN algorithms, such as GraphSage, PinSage, and GNN Explainer. Rex worked on a variety of applications of graph learning in physics simulation, social networks, NLP, knowledge graphs, and biology. And he developed the first billion-scale graph embedding services at Pinterest and the graph-based anomaly detection algorithm at Amazon. And he won the KDD Dissertation Award 2022. So thanks, Rex, for joining us today. And please feel free to start.
Hi, thanks, Bahara, for the introduction. Yeah, I'm very happy to be here to share some of my recent works and thoughts, and happy to hear feedbacks as well, because some of the works are relatively more recent and still in submission. Okay, so the title of the talk is graph learning when applied to many data that is not directly related to a graph structure. So we've already seen a lot of success in terms of graph learning, achieving prominent results over the past few years on data that can be expressed directly as graphs. Examples are social networks, recommender systems, molecules, knowledge graphs, proteins, and many other things, right? And people do make a lot of progress in terms of like GNN architectures, modeling, in terms of like doing transfer learning, AutoML, many different aspects for graph learning. And today I'm just going to also share a little bit different perspective, because in real world, there are also many types of important data that are not graphs. You know, we see images, natural languages, tabular data, time series, and all these kind of things. And people have already explored, you know, perhaps graphs can be useful in these areas as a representation. And today I'm going to share some of the more recent work that we explored in terms of using graph learning to help deep learning models in many other areas to achieve even better results in various domains. And hopefully this can you know, increase the impact of graph learning and allow it to be applied to even more broader kind of use cases. So these here I'm going to list 4 of these topics that I'm going to share today. One of them is the using graph learning for AutoML using something we construct called design graphs. And the second one is also related to search, which is going to talk about you know, learning heuristics using a kind of a graph structure, and to go from start to a destination very efficiently. And we use graphs to learn to do that in like real world road data, for example. And the third project, we're using it to assist the pre-training and self-supervised learning. We basically construct graphs or so-called proximity graphs between examples of data, and we obtain hard negative examples such that it can help with self-supervised learning in like a general setting, not just graphs, but also in NLP and in image self-supervised learning. Okay. And the final one, I'm going to talk about efficient transformers, which we can view it as a sparse attention between tokens, and we construct these special attention graphs and use some graph techniques to help with designing those efficient transformers. And actually, I'm going to start with the efficient transformer project and go kind of backwards. Okay. And the key question I want to share is whether we can leverage these kind of relational inductive bias that are inherent in data that are not directly manifested as graphs, and use these inductive biases in modeling these problems and help machine learning in these other data modalities. Okay. Yep, I'm going to first introduce the efficient transformer work, and then I'll go to these various search problems as well as self-supervised learning or pre-training. So the first work is in IEEE 2023, which we call diffuser. We know just a little bit of background, right? Transformer has changed deep learning so much that nowadays state-of-the-art representation learning always use transformers to do either some form of pre-training, fine-tuning, or transfer learning, right? For example, in NLP, BERT was the one of the earliest transformer-based architecture. And since then, NLP is pretty much dominated by such architecture. And in computer vision, more recently, vision transformer has achieved a very remarkable accuracy, beating some of the previous very popular methods like ResNet, VGG, and a bunch of CogNets. Transformer looks like this. I guess for this audience, I don't have to explain much, right? So we have some input, and we pretty much come up with various matrices of Q, K, V. So these are the query keys and values, and we combine them in such a way that we compute an attention matrix, and then use the weighted attention matrix to multiply by the value matrix, and we finally obtain the representation for the next layer, and we kind of stack that multiple times, right? So the bottleneck, as you can see here, is this green thing, the green matrix, which is number of tokens times number of tokens, and this quadratic complexity kind of limits the length of the token that you can do for transformers, right? So, for example, popular architectures like GPT, they can at least that was the case for 3, right? I don't know about 4, but kind of limits the length to I think 512 tokens or something, because when it goes to larger number of tokens, the memory kind of grows dramatically, as well as the training and inference time. Vision transformer, for example, also does the superpixel thing, right? To group them into 197 tokens, so it's with 16 times 16 pixels as a patch, right? So 16 times 14 is 254. And then one final token for the like an extra token. But we also see a lot of non-sequences, right? For example, if we look at the entire research paper, which might be closely connected, right? The last paragraph of conclusion is closely related to the first paragraph and so on. So we're looking at the very long sequences, and we also look at some additional tasks, like in NLP, there are byte level tasks, which means that the sequence length is even longer. There's also image patches. If we make like these patch sizes even smaller, you would get a lot of tokens, and not to mention time series, right? In real world time series like sensor data and so on, you would typically encounter sequence length of even more than hundreds of thousands, and quadratic time with respect to that length is just not feasible, because as you can see, the GPU memory as well as the training and inference time just grows dramatically with respect to the length of the token. Okay, and there are some existing work on sparse transformers, and most notably the Longformer and BigBird, which are some of the earlier approach that utilizes these inductive biases, because people notice that a lot of times, most likely the words are going to pay attention to words that are nearby. So they created this kind of local attention pattern. So these are the red block that is sort of block diagonal. And there is also global attention, which means we have a single word that is so can be particularly important as serve as a hub. So everyone basically pays attention to it. It pays attention to everything, right? So as a global token that was also added in BigBird, and then at the end, BigBird also added a bunch of these random attention tokens, right? So those green parts here. So the thing is, so one insight that we can draw is when we try to sparsify this attention to make it more efficient and achieve a complexity reduction, we can treat this problem as looking at a graph sparsification problem, right? So you can imagine that the previous full quadratic attention basically means you have a fully connected graph, and now we are creating some sort of graph structure that is relatively sparse, right? And the sparsity is basically the improvement in terms of complexity, okay? And there like these kind of approximation, right? Like Big Bird, Longformer, and all these sparse transformers, they all have some limitations. And typically, we use some kind of assumption, like proximity, which is the case for sparse transformers. And there's also low rank assumption, which is another type of sparse transformer, like that uses the low rank assumption of the attention matrix, right? And these can result in several issues, right? So for example, here, one issue is that the information propagation is just slower with those local windows, right? As you can see in the first layer, you're only paying attention to your nearby neighbors. So you have this block diagonal, but hopefully in the next layer, your receptive field gets larger. Right? In the third layer, you can finally talk to every other token from any other token, right? So this is essentially kind of related to the diameter or the path length of the attention graph, the underlying attention graph, the connectivity between the tokens. In this case, we need 3 hops to attend from the first token to the last token. And as you can see, this is a limitation because if we make this sparse attention really sparse, then the number of hops that you need to pay attention to words that are far away kind of have to increase, right? So that's a kind of undesirable property. The other one is that there is sometimes an issue with robustness because sometimes you can change or swap a word from the end to the front. It doesn't really change the meaning so much, but the kind of attention pattern is dramatically different, right? You were previously you were not paying attention to the word at the end, but if you move the word at the end to the front, it's kind of changing the attention that you the pattern you have for these words, and the model might get confused. Okay? And so in this work, which we call diffuser, what we do is basically use attention diffusion to solve the problem of like slow information propagation and so on. The idea is that we kind of use graph diffusion as a way to augment these sparse transformers through this notion called attention diffusion. Intuitively, you are kind of diffusing the attention values from those local window or like very sparse, extremely sparse pattern to something like to tokens that are further away or not directly connected. So that's the kind of intuition, right? So for example, again, is the example here, the one step, like the original attention, let's say, looks like the one on the left. After one step of diffusion, it diffuses to more number of nodes. So we get attention values for a lot of nodes. And then in the third step, you basically get all the attentions. So someone might ask, right? If diffusion and make it fully quadratic, then what's the point, right? It's we were talking about sparse attention. The point is that for those values that are diffused, it's directly a function of the attention value of the tokens in the first step, right, on the left. So for example, the top right corner of the last step diffusion is basically a function of the sparse pattern, like the attention that we learn in the sparse pattern. So because these are directly a function, there is no learnable parameters involved. So the learnable parameters are only associated with this sparse pattern at the beginning, and everything else is just a function that can be directly computed with the attention we obtain in the first step of diffusion. Okay? So I guess you still need to store this quadratic thing, but the backprop is a lot more efficient because you don't have to compute a lot of gradients for most of the attention values in the transformer. Okay, so this is another like graph representation of this. So we represent every token as a node, and tokens attend to each other in the transformer, right? And instead of doing a dense transformer, we kind of compute the attention in a very sparse pattern. So these are the the blue edges that we draw between these tokens, and then we basically perform diffusion. So going from first step to the next step, and then now we can have an attention value from the target node from the one token to a token that is not directly connected to the target token through the sparse attention, right? So despite not having this attention token, we still can compute the attention through this diffusion process. Okay, so just a little bit of detail. That's probably the only technical slide at least for this project. So we have the standard attention using QKV, right? Standard, and in the attention diffusion, the only thing that gets changed is this adjacency, or I guess here it's the attention matrix gets replaced by this diffused attention matrix, the curly A thing, and the curly A is by definition of graph diffusion is basically the sum of a bunch of powers of A, right? Weighted by this alpha, where alpha represents a teleport probability. So so it's kind of like a random walk kind of notion. And we can do this efficiently through an approximation. So we just do a power iteration. So instead of summing to infinity, at every step, we basically multiply the results by the adjacency and adds the previous value, previous result. So this is an iterative approach to approximate a graph diffusion, and we can use that by setting, let's say, k equals to 5 to efficiently compute the diffused attention here. Okay, so that's kind of the whole technical detail. And when k equals to infinity, we cannot approximate, like we cannot have the diffused adjacency, but in practice, we usually set, say, k equals to 5, which means this process becomes quite fast with a GPU. So another graphical illustration. So this is like this attention transformer kind of architecture, right? So here, instead of doing this attention, we basically create a sparse pattern, and then we do graph diffusion here to obtain the attention for all the other pairs that are not directly connected, and then we get the full attention matrix, and then we basically do the next layer computation, right? We obtain the next layer representation. Okay, so here is like a comparison of the sparse pattern we designed and how it contrasts to the previous two sparse transformers that I mentioned, for example, Longformer and Big Bird. As you can see, like because we have the diffusion process, we are not worried about having it being too sparse. We can make it really sparse because after diffusion, we get attention from like every other token anyways. So instead of having those large blocks in, say, Longformer Big Bird, our diagonal local window blocks are much smaller. And another observation is instead of having a lot of blocks of random attention, now our random attention, so these blue small blocks are a lot smaller. So in fact, they are just token, like the granularity is just per token. Whereas in Big Bird, these these blue box, every of these blue block is basically a 64 times 64 dense submatrix. So so in that sense, we are a lot sparser than previous sparse transformers, and you can also see it here, like the amount of memories being allocated for diffuser versus Big Bird and Longformer. Okay, yeah, so we're not worried about it being too sparse because we sort of have this theoretical understanding. So this one is basically following the previous Big Bird proof, and we show that it is still a universal approximator, which means that for any function, we can still use this sparse, very sparse pattern using the diffuser transformer to approximate that function. So the proof is kind of quite similar to Big Bird, but there's also the other aspect which I want to emphasize because it's not just about expressive power, but also about the fact that how information can propagate very quickly compared to previous sparse transformers. So here we use this notion called expander graphs, which is a common notion, like a common technique that tries to describe a sparse graph that has a strong connectivity patterns despite its sparsity, right? So for example, an example of sparse expander graph is drawn below, right? There isn't that many edges compared to the quadratic, like compared to 12, 13 squared, for example, but they are very closely connected, right? The path from any token to any other token is pretty small. So this is just an example of an expander graph, and we sort of use proofs to say that diffuser after the diffusion of the attention, it can also become a d epsilon expanded graph. So this is sort of an informal description, but the detailed proof is in the paper. And because of that expanded property, we can say that this attention diffusion mixes rapidly on the sparse pattern, which means that after very few steps of diffusion, you can already get a very good pattern that is very closely connected to each other. So you don't need many layers for any token to talk to any other token. Right? And it also improves expanded property as we perform diffusion at every step. So just a little bit about experiments. So similar to all previous works, we are trying it on various long sequence data, including text and image, and then also long range arena, which has a lot of, I guess, some text and some time series as well. And we actually use a graph library to do this. So here are some some results. So the diffuser is on the blue part, which shows that we consistently achieve a lower memory usage despite having to do diffusion on the attention matrix, and that outperforms many of the previous sparse transformers. And in terms of runtime, we're not the fastest, right? The blue line is sort of in the middle, just because there is still this dense matrix multiplication that is needed, and also because we need to iteratively do diffusion for multiple times. But sometimes these patterns can be pre-computed. But we do realize that it's not the fastest possible, but it achieves a lot of memory savings. Okay, so here are some results. We have the pre-training task for language, and we can show that it achieves better performance on masked language modeling. It also does well in fine-tuning tasks like text classification and question answering, given a trained sparse transformer. So we achieved better results to other previous transformers, and achieves almost similar or even higher result than dense transformers. And we also show a strong performance compared in terms of image tests, as well as long-range arena benchmarks. I just want to add one more page on one additional improvement that we are currently thinking about, which is also on sparse transformer, and is also trying to use the notion of graphs to improve the efficiency. So here the idea is that we feel like discovering a sparse pattern is more like a generation problem. So previously, all these patterns were kind of designed by hand, so like heuristic to understand the local window and stuff like that, right? But can we use can we use a gradient descent? Can we use machine learning to optimize for a sparse pattern? So that's kind of the question that we want to ask. And the point is, you cannot just directly optimize for all, like as a mask or something, because the whole point of sparse transformer is to make it sparse, and if you optimize like a dense mask, you kind of defeat the purpose. So instead, what we do is we use this kind of chronicle generation that was done. I think you already proposed it many years ago, but we kind of used it for designing sparse patterns. So we can decompose a large attention matrix into those small attention patterns, and then we do chronicle product on it to get the large attention pattern. And the benefit of this is actually it corresponds a lot to the hierarchical inductive bias in many things, or in many data sets, like for example, in text, there's like sentence and paragraph. So there's this kind of hierarchical structure, and these chronicle products basically corresponds to attention between paragraphs, and then attention between sentences, and then attention between words, and so on. This is an ongoing work. Aside from that, I'm going to also talk about some of the search problems, and so this is another work that we did last year on learning graph search heuristics. This can be applied to many scenarios, and search is an important problem. So in, for example, chemistry, robotics, biology, and many other things, we always have this problem of starting from something and we want to search over like a very large search space, right? And typically for these robotics and engineering, like A star is a very effective way to do it, and based on a heuristic, right? So at every step, you just kind of use the heuristic to estimate how far away you are from the destination, and you can decide where to go next, depending on the estimation of the distance. Okay, and so in this case, we basically formulated as a search graph problem. So we start from like a initial state, and then we want to sort of reach the destination, and we want to use an A star like algorithm. But instead of designing the heuristic by hand, we sort of use a machine learning, like an imitation learning approach to learn this estimated distance from the destination. So here I'm basically colored all these search various colors. The gray ones are unseen nodes, so the search space can be enormous, and the gray ones are enormous, and we don't necessarily know every single one of them, right? It can be exponentially large. And the yellow nodes are the fringe nodes, which are adjacent to the visit nodes. And the visit nodes basically means nodes that we have already tried out. Okay, and we basically want to learn a heuristic H data that kind of approximates or learns to approximate how far away you are from a destination. And this function is a neural network that is parameterized by some parameter theta. Okay, and the challenge here is that it's not always feasible to do, let's say, supervised learning. In experiment, we find it to be a lot worse just because the search space is so big that your example supervision cannot really cover everything in this search space, right? And model-free RL also doesn't work well in the setting. There's a link I posted, so this link links to a previous paper that says why model-free RL doesn't work, and we also have the high requirement that the model should run kind of constant with respect to the dimensions of the search space, right? So make it very efficient at every step. We don't want every step to take very long. So yeah, this is the overall kind of intuition, and I'll just basically walk through what we do. So we start from this search problem, and at every step, we want to basically pick one of these fringe nodes to walk to, right? So which yellow nodes are we going to go next? And we do that by learning an algorithm that approximates the distance between the search node, these yellow nodes, to the destination. And we do that by taking into account of a history, because we know that a lot of times the sequence actually matters. It's not like strictly Markovian. So we sort of use like a sequence, something like an RNN to capture the history of the search. And so we have some kind of row-in algorithm. So with the current model, we row it in by a number of steps to obtain the representations at every node that we have visited so far. And then we start the rollout, which means we compute like this estimated distance to this to the destination. And this will happen. So during training time, we also get a bunch of these oracle distances. So this is in the imitation learning setting. So we have some examples that we can imitate from. So some, for example, examples of how people have reached certain destination. And from these examples, we can compute these oracle distances to the destination. And those are basically our supervision, right? The only difference between the supervised learning is just that we have this row-in and row-out that allow the algorithms to learn the trajectories, learn the strategies of the example runs that oracles did. In the next step, basically we compute these estimated distance. We compute the loss, and in the algorithm we basically expand to the next node. So we pick one of the fringe node that's supposed to have a smaller distance to the destination. We pick that, and then we expand the fringe node. So that's very similar to like a typical search. So how do we decide this H, right? So how do we predict the heuristic distance? So we have, it's basically like a GNN, but with a temporal component to record the history of the search. So if you look at the third line, it's pretty much a message passing, right? So we have this aggregation. So this plus with a circle is like the aggregation of the neighborhood of the message function, and the message function is basically a function of the current state, and then the previous state, and then the edge, right? So this step, the third step is basically the message passing, and the fourth step is the RNN, or the temporal component, where we update the current state according to the history, right? So with both steps, we kind of obtain the representation of these fringe node states, and then we do an MLP to predict the distance. So yeah, this is pretty simple. Okay, and here the input, we have these fringe nodes, and we also okay. So in the second step, we do the message passing, right? It's as I said, it's standard GNN, and the third step is the permutation invariant state update. So it's the RNN that does the update, and then finally just use an MLP to make the prediction. Okay, so we did some experimental comparison. So here the blue ones are the learning-based methods. So some of the previous ones like SAIL and Neural A star and a bunch of others. And there are also classical methods. So the ones in the red box are those that does not use any learning algorithm. And this metric uses this measurement of the ratio of the visited nodes during the search with respect to A star. So A star always gets 1. It's like the baseline, the standard, the easiest thing you can do. And we record, like, say, for example, how many percentage of the nodes visited by each method compared to the number of nodes visited in A star. And what we found is that FAIL, which is our method called path heuristic imitation learning, on average is only, for example, in the first line, in this first maze kind of environment, I guess all of them are maze-like environment. In the first line, it only explores, say, 2% of the nodes compared to, or 2% of the space compared to the A star algorithm. So it represents 58.5 average reduction in terms of the number of nodes being explored with respect to these any of the top baselines. And the implementation is also a lot faster than most other learning-based methods. And here's some visualization. So one of the previous state-of-the-art imitation learning algorithm called SAIL. SAIL is on the left and ours is on the right. And as you can see, when navigating over this maze-like environment, SAIL has to try out a lot of things. So the blue ones are those places that are visited by the algorithm, and FAIL in comparison visited a lot less, right? It basically utilized these inductive biases of these environments very well, that it has a more intelligent heuristic, and it can effectively search over this space without visiting too many nodes. Okay, and here's like a real world scenario where it's also not a graph, it's more like a road network. And we have a starting destination, and we have a starting destination in the city of Italy. And FAIL basically finds this path very well, whereas A star has trouble because this particular city has a lot of like very weird roads and dead ends and all these things. So A star, with this naive heuristic, they will have to explore a lot more compared to FAIL. So here there's also a caveat, right? Like it's because the underlying road structure is very complex that studying a particular inductive bias or heuristic strategy is meaningful, right? Imagine that this is not Italy, this is Manhattan in New York. This wouldn't have such a big difference because Manhattan, all the roads are kind of horizontal or vertical. A star will probably do extremely well, and we wouldn't gain that kind of improvement. So it's kind of depends on the inductive biases of the data set. Okay? And this is another one, kind of a short experiment on like the drones to do this path finding. And we kind of have a starting goal and a destination. And we also run various heuristics and our algorithm. and we found that field remains like in 4.9% of the oracle, which is the shortest path. So field finds a very feasible shortest path, and is also exploring a lot less in terms of number of nodes compared to other heuristics. Okay, so yeah, so that's the second one. And the third one is also related to search, right? AutoML is also kind of search. So you can imagine what I would do here, right? Basically construct this kind of graph related to search, and using graph search heuristics or techniques like GNN to predict where to search in this like AutoML setting, right? So just to recap, AutoML is basically about finding the best architecture. So we're using GNN as an example, but it's not like being restricted by such a by the GNN setting, right? We can do AutoML on CNNs, we can do AutoMLs on transformers and all these, right? And there are several requirements. We wanted to be mindful, like we wanted to utilize this knowledge of architectural design. We want to be efficient in terms of this AutoML search, even for very large models. And we want it to be transferable. And we also want it to be interpretable. We want to extract insights from it, right? And here on the right is an example of a GNN design space, and we want to search for the best architecture there. Okay, so there are some traditional methods like random search, Bayesian optimization, etc. That usually work very well in the past. And more recently, there's also learnable AutoML through weight optimization. An example was Dart 4 or 5 years ago. And there are also reinforcement learning-based approaches to try to find strategies to search for the best architecture. So some existing challenges here is that every step of AutoML is quite expensive, because when exploring a new node or a new design of the architecture, you have to retrain the model kind of. So it's resource hungry, and we want to minimize the number of steps needed to do the search. Okay, and also many of these methods, such as Bayesian optimization, doesn't directly utilize architecture design information. So some examples I listed here. For example, we find that batch norm and dropout sometimes don't work well, and then some maybe like deep graph neural networks should use layer norm, or maybe the relation between embedding dimensions and dataset size has a kind of like a certain pattern in order to achieve good performance. So these kind of insights are not directly encoded if you just do this kind of search like Bayesian or simulating annealing kind of approaches. So the approach that we are trying out is to use this notion called meta model, which directly takes the design of an architecture as a feature, and then use a model to make a prediction of what this design is going to perform on the data set. Right? So for example, here, given this design, the model makes a prediction that this design is going to have 0.78 accuracy. So this kind of thing. But this is not very easy to do, because first of all, we don't have that. The data set is extremely small, because as I mentioned, each run of the data set is expensive, because we need to retrain the model. And secondly, we also aim to leverage more structure between these designs and draw correlations between these designs and help with this model prediction, right? So that's why we come up with this experiment on design graphs. So the design graphs, by definition, is just a graph of architectures. So every node here represents a neural network architecture, and the edges between them represents the difference between these architectures. So we basically connect two architectures with an edge, if and only if these two architectures are similar or the same except one design dimension. So for example, here, I think I have like these two architectures. The only difference between them is the number of layers. The number of layers, massive passing layer in architecture 1 is 8, and the number of layers in architecture 2 is 6. So we connect an edge and add an edge feature of corresponding to 2 message passing layers. So we can add these edges that tells us about the relation between different kinds of architectures. And now with this, we can kind of train a graph neural network to to understand the relation between these kind of architectures in order to make predictions, right? And here design, basically the architectural design becomes the node feature, and we can make prediction based on that. Oh, I think the slides are, the format's weird. Let me try it. Okay, never mind. I can just continue, but like, you can still see the figure, which consists of two parts. There's the task agnostic part and the task specific part. So the task agnostic part is basically this GNN prediction I talked about. We use a graph neural network to predict the model performance given an architectural feature, right? And then there's also the task specific module, which also takes into account of the model performance. So we have those green nodes where we have run, or actually we have those red nodes where we already have experimental results, and we have those green nodes that are not yet explored. So we have some side information here. For example, how well this model does in this data set. So we want to also use this model performance to inform or to predict what's the current node's model performance. Because we have this graph, we can kind of use this inductive bias that similar architecture usually results in similar model performance on the data set, right? So with this kind of assumption, we can also use this task-specific module to make prediction. And then we basically concatenate them together and use a multi-layer perceptron to make the to derive the architectural embedding for each neural network architecture here, each node, and then make prediction on the performance. So a short note is that we are trying to use ranking loss instead of directly supervising with the performance metric like accuracy, because it's often easier to train with ranking loss, and it's not sensitive to the magnitude of the metric like accuracy or AUC, things like that. So with ranking loss, we'll basically compare two nodes and say which one has a higher, is predicted to have a higher performance. Okay, I won't go into the detail, but there's also another important component which is very similar to the search algorithm that I described before, right? Basically, at every step, we want to minimize the number of steps taken in order to reach the optimal architecture for the task. So we need a very efficient search model that kind of search for the best architecture through this model prediction. So we have at every step we kind of train this model, and we find the predicted best architecture, and then we basically go there, right? And after we go there, we retrain the model, because now we have this performance data for this new architecture. So we can update our meta model to incorporate this new data. And then we make the prediction from the meta model again to search for the best. And then we update the meta model again, and so on, right? So it's kind of an iterative approach. Okay, so I'll go into the just a quick result slide. So we basically tested the performance of the architecture search with respect to the number of explored architecture. So on the left figure, the x-axis is the number of architectures that we have explored, which means 50 would mean that we have run 50 times, like 50 different architectures to obtain the performance data to train the meta model and to do the AutoML, right? And Falcon, which is our method, is the blue line here. So what we discover is our method usually can already achieve a very high accuracy with only 50 architectures being explored. In fact, only with 10 to 20 architectures explored, we have already achieved very high performance compared to many of the baselines, such as Bayesian optimization and random search and simulated annealing. And the middle figure is basically the graph classification. So we also measure the brute force. So brute force means that this is a very small data set. So we kind of brute force search all possible architectures in our design space. And this is like the upper bound we can get. Falcon, which is our method, can basically achieve very close to the brute force. So is as good as if you kind of search over the entire search space with just 55 architectures being explored. Okay, and we also plot the design space embeddings, where each point here represents an architecture, and we can see that there is some kind of smoothness in terms of performance. So like architectures that are has similar performance, as can be seen by the color here. So the color represents the kind of the performance. From green is the low performance, and the blue, dark blue, is the highest performance. So there's kind of the smoothness structure. Okay, and finally, I will briefly mention the proximity graph project that we have been doing, and this is a recent submission, so not yet published. So in supervised learning here, we are looking at contrastive learning approaches, which is very intuitive. So we have examples, and we embed them. And in contrastive learning, we put similar stuff close together, and then we put those negative example or far away things very kind of push them kind of far away, right? So a very popular contrastive learning loss is called info-NCE loss. So we have the term that maximizes the similarity between positive examples and then minimize the similarity. Maximize the similarity and then between the positive examples, and then minimize the similarity between, so maximize the distance between the negative examples, right? So this can be adapted to many data modalities. It's used in images, used in text, graphs, tables, and many things, right? So here, what we want to investigate is how would we sample negatives, because it's like a very important thing. And what people realize is hard negative pairs are very important. So by hard negative pairs, we mean that pairs that negative examples that look somewhat similar to the positive, like to the sample or to the query, but not that similar. So it's relatively harder to distinguish these hard negatives from these positive examples. So those ones really pose a challenge to the model and really helps the model to gain good performance. And some of the previous approaches have shown that. And there are so info-NCE, in contrast to triplet loss, which people have also used before, does this in-batch sampling, which means that given a data set, it just samples a mini batch, and within the mini batch, it tries to find those hard negative examples, right? So maybe these two are somewhat, so every row represents like positive examples, but aside from the positive, I need a negative example. I basically look at the other images, and I find one that is reasonably close, and I connect them. Right, so that will be my negative example. So this is the way they use for a negative example. And we consider like the choice of hard negatives as like two kind of extremes. The first extreme is that we just don't do any effort. We just do uniform sampling. Like we randomly sample a bunch of instances, and then we see like any of these instances in the batch will be used as negative examples for like other pairs, right? So you can see it as like a random instance as a negative. So these negatives are not hard, obviously. It's just random, so it's relatively easy to distinguish. But then there's also KNN, which is a very aggressive strategy to find negative examples. So you basically retrieve a set of nearest neighbors of your image or your text or whatever in your contrastive learning setting, and you construct this batch with all these nearest neighbors, right? Then if you pick a random thing in your mini batch through this in-batch sampling, chances are you are picking something that is very close because it's already like part of your nearest neighbor set, right? You're picking something really hard. But the problem is there can be some false negatives, right? Because you are using nearest neighbor, there could actually be some positives there in the set of negative samples you choose, and that will really confuse your classifier. So so both approaches can have shortcomings, right? So what we want to do is sort of to bridge between this nearest neighbor versus random sampling. And what we do is to construct this proximity graph between all these instances. So here the graph is a collection of nodes, and the nodes represent images or text or whatever we want to do contrastive learning for. And the edges are the similarities in terms of their embeddings. Okay, so when constructing this graph, we randomly pick a bunch of these neighbor candidates to form this candidate set. And in this candidate set, we can add these edges, right? Edges between these examples, depending on their proximity to each other in the embedding space. So in this proposed graph sampling scheme, in order to find negative examples, we basically do like a balance between breadth first search and depth first search. So it's very similar to like what people commonly do in graph mining, right? You can do a random walk and stuff. So the idea is that you don't want to find the nearest neighbor, but you also don't want to find random stuff. You want to trade off between them and find a sweet spot where you can reliably find all these very hard negative examples without having too much false negatives. Okay? False negatives means that you treat them as negative examples, but they are actually positive examples. Okay, so yeah, as I mentioned, this is basically an interpolation through this proximity graph construction. So we can see that uniform sampling in the plot, which is on the far left, and then KNN sampler performance is on the far right. So we are kind of finding a sweet spot in between, right? And there exists some consistent parameter setting such that we use this parameter setting to perform random walk and find negative examples that are particularly suitable for doing self-supervised contrastive learning. And this is an example in CFAR dataset. So I'm not going to show more dataset because of the limit of the time. But yeah, I'm going to quickly conclude what I have mentioned. So we see various ways that we try to use graph learning for solving tasks that are not directly related to graph as a data set. And we basically use graphs as a general tool to model all these relations between entities and construct these relations between these entities in various different ways. Right, and we do see that graph learning can benefit non-graph data by exploring and drawing these explicit or sometimes implicit connections between data, and a lot of these applications closely related to meta learning, planning, search, things that really need relation between each other, right? So yeah, I do hope that this talk can give you some extra idea in terms of using relational inductive bias or using GNNs to solve various problems outside the domain of graphs in your own research. So yeah, I think that's the end of my talk, and thanks very much. If you have questions, I think feel free to raise, and I think we have like 5 minutes or so.
Thank you so much, Rex, for the great talk. So I see that a lot of people attended. So any first questions? Please feel free to ask or type in the chat and I can read. In the meantime that people are thinking about the question, what other type of problem you are applying graph methods to? You mentioned a couple of them, but okay, we have the first question. Let me first.
Yeah, sure. So one example is we are trying it on neuroscience data. So these are basically time series data of fMRI that is recorded from patients. So you can see them as like neurons having all these different time series. And we want to make prediction of whether like the patient has certain disease or has certain issue with the brain condition. So there is no like explicit connectome in a functional MRI data, but we can draw correlations between these time series to find connectivities between these functional groups of neurons. And yeah, so like learning to discover these clusters or connectivities between neurons in terms of their functional data, and we use this discovered structure to make prediction of patient property. So that's like one ongoing work that we are currently working on. And there we use the notion of hypergraphs instead of normal graphs because the interactions between neurons are oftentimes like more than 2, right? We have multiple groups of neurons interacting each other. So hypergraphs are particularly convenient there. I guess that's an example.
Interesting. Yes, that's very interesting. So I think we have a couple of questions. So Xushang, do you want to start?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Rex, for the interesting talk. So I have a question about the second project. Basically, you showed one about the search project. Basically, you showed one data set of that city in Italy. I was thinking about how did you train your model for that city? Like, how did you get the ground truth?
Yeah. So so this is imitation learning. So we basically have some starting point and destination data there. So let's say in my training data set, I have one destination on the south of the city, one starting point at the north of the city, and there is a path that like sort of like an oracle. So the good thing is you don't have to have a very large data set. It's only like 100 of these things would be often sufficient. But the path itself contains a lot of data points, right? It goes from one place to the other and then to the other. So we have those data sets being collected. That's the only difference with RL, because RL, you wouldn't have these examples. And here we have a few of these Oracle demonstrations, and we're basically learning a strategy from these demonstrations. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I get the idea. So it seems like you're saying only through, say, maybe a few hundred Oracle passes in the city, your model would be able to generalize, say, more far away destinations and like more complicated.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So basically, it tries to learn the pattern of these demonstrations and then use that as a heuristic for future searches. So, so it's not even if it's just like 100 of these. Every path is non-trivial, so every path can be pretty long. The path itself can contain like 100 search states. So, so we essentially have like 100 times 100 kind of supervision, if that makes sense.
I see. This is very interesting. Maybe a follow-up question is like, do you think this kind of trained model can generalize to different cities, or maybe there could be a gap between the distribution across cities?
Yeah, good question. So we haven't done too much in generalization because this is about like the goal we're trying to do is like specialization. We want this like in general, I don't think you can like beat A star by very much, right? But in a specific kind of inductive bias, like we can learn a very good heuristic compared to A star. But it's a good question. I don't think we have tested like how general these learned strategies are. But I imagine that there has to be some common inductive biases between these data sets in order for the learned heuristic to work.
Okay, thank you so much.
No problem.
Okay, so we have 3 questions that have been written into the chat. So I can read. So the first one is a little bit more general. So are you currently working on increasing the data set for the meta models?
You mean like trying out different data sets for the AutoML algorithm?
Yes,
so
I think increasing the data. Maybe.
Like the amount of data you use.
Yes.
Okay.
I think so.
I see. Yeah, we try to use as little data as possible because we really want the AutoML algorithm to be efficient. But yeah, like we do try an effort to scale the data set. For example, the largest data set we do for graph learning AutoML was like close to 1 million nodes, I think, like 500,000 nodes or something. So training the model itself is not easy. Like it's a few hours at least. But because our search only search over a very small number of steps, we can still do it very efficiently, maybe hopefully in 1 or 2 days or something.
Right. Okay, I'm hoping that my impression from the question was great. So the second question from ZG. So, and the question is, since we have witnessed the huge success of GPT-4, do you see any opportunities to use graph techniques to further enhance or utilize GPT-4?
Yeah, that's always something that I've been thinking. Like obviously, like sparse transformer and stuff I talk about efficient transformer can really help with the efficiency aspect, right? But another thing that I think is really cool is multimodal learning. So here we are going to say like from image to text, from text to image, right? But what about image to graph, graph to text, things like that. And a very strong motivation is, current image generation is doing really great at generating realistic things. But if I ask it to do something very specific, like generate me exactly 10 computers in the room with 2 windows, that are close to a wall, like a sofa or whatever, like being very specific in terms of objects and their relations, the generated results are often not that great, right? So with a language model, like GPT-4, you can sort of understand what the user's intention is, and if we kind of translate that into like a relation between entities and structures, and then kind of generate an image, based on like that is faithful to these objects and their relations, then we are generating something a lot more meaningful and faithful to the requirements of the user. So that's something I'm also currently working on. And I thought, like in general, multimodal aspects is just amazing, and I think graph can play a good, very nice role here.
Yes, that's very interesting.
Also, like molecule to text, text to molecule, like literature about medical things,
Right,
and all that. Yeah,
that would be very interesting. That's true. Okay, so the other question is, hi Rex, thank you for the talk. Could you elaborate about the last topic you discussed? I don't understand very well how your proposed approach works. How does the proximity graph help to mine hard negatives while avoiding false positives?
Yeah, sorry, I do realize that I was being like too brief on this. So the idea is that we kind of draw these distances between these examples. So the distance are like the distance between feature or like representation that tells us how far away each examples is from each other, and the goal is to sample hard negatives, which means that the goal is to sample examples that are close together, like that are like closely connected, or like within 2 hops or 3 hops, right? From the query example, but not too far away, but also not too close, because if it's like immediately next to the image, then the chances are it's going to be actually a positive example, not a hard negative. We want to find hard negatives, so those images that are not positive but still reasonably similar. So that's why we kind of perform this kind of random walk like thing to use the proximity graph as a medium to find examples that are sort of close but not that close, so that you kind of get a sweet spot that is that doesn't give you a lot of false negatives, but also doesn't give you very easy negative examples. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. But yeah, it's still a working submission. So hopefully it will be in KDD 2023, and yeah, I think it's likely to get into KDD 2023, and we'll be able to post it online.
So are you tuning these parameters for different data sets, or no, one set of parameters work? Yeah, so we find the parameters to be pretty robust. So for example, the CFAR one, I forgot where it is, like this CFAR have parameters for the random walk, most so very well for like graph contrastive learning, for example. So I don't think we need to tune that much. It's mostly kind of stable, like somewhere in between is just good. But yeah, it's not going to be optimal. For optimal ones, you still have to do hyperparameter search. A little bit of work. Okay, is there any last question? Otherwise, Edna, if you want to stop the recording, feel free. Okay.